Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seat as we are starting next session right now. Please take your seat. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special MED conversation with Paolo Gentiloni, EU Commissioner for the Economy. Buongiorno and welcome, Gentiloni.
Buongiorno.
And I'm delighted to share the stage this morning with an outstanding colleague and friend, Amy Kellogg from Fox. Hello, Amy. You know, there's plenty to discuss on the table, and our time budget is just 30 minutes. So, Amy, please, with the first question.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Andrea is more the specialist on financial matters, and I'm looking at things more from a generalist perspective. Commissioner, you've said that making great success of the expenditure of these EU COVID recovery funds, much of which will happen in 2022, will be both the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity for the year. The numbers are eye-popping. 800 billion is the one that sticks with me. I think probably a lot of people feel similarly that, what does this mean? You know, really, how do you see, and do you see it already making a positive change in people's lives, or the recovery of various cities and countries in the EU zone?
Well, yes, thank you for this question, and buongiorno a tutti. A great pleasure to be here in Rome for the MED dialogues. Well, indeed, of course, it's a lot of money, a big amount. Only the core of this next generation EU that we call Recovery and Resilience Fund, RRF acronym, is at current prices 800 billions. But apart from the amount, I think the framework is essential. First, the methodology, the unprecedented decision to have a common debt for common purpose, which, as you know, was very improbable until a couple of years ago. And it was a decision historical in some way. I remember the quasi-chancellor Olaf Scholz calling it a Hamiltonian moment for the Union. I think the president of the European Council called it a Copernican revolution. I've heard some colleagues using the Rubiconian moment. So, well, okay. Indeed, it was something quite new and unprecedented. Interesting in two ways. First, it is not only traditional funding, it is funding going especially to countries more affected by this pandemic or having previous economic difficulties. So it is also very useful to reduce the risk of divergence and fragmentation in the single market. And second, it is money quite with conditionalities. Because it's not a check that we are giving to member states, but it is something strictly connected to priorities in investment that the Commission has established, the green investment, the digital investment, blah, 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 and on reforms that we asked, encouraged for years and years, but now you have a firepower from a fiscal point of view to make these reforms possible. So this is why it's really something completely new, very promising, but then, as you know, the famous proof of the pudding, we will see.
Well, Commissioner, you mentioned Oliver Scholz's Hamiltonian moment. Do you expect Germany to remain so enthusiastic also when you will get into the deep of the discussion on the new fiscal framework? You know, the Sustainability and Growth Pact, the Stability and Growth Pact has been suspended, but it will be back. And after Merkel, do you think that Germany will take a tougher stance on this? And what are the first signs from the dialogue that you're beginning?
Well, of course, we can only refer to what is now in the German government contract. You know that this agreement is quite serious in the political German tradition. It takes a certain time to reach an agreement on this program, and the program is very important. It's not the same way in each and every country. Everyone has its own tradition, but the German tradition is that this government contract is important. And I have to say that in this contract we have interesting overture on the fiscal issues. This doesn't mean that finding a solution, a compromise, a deal on fiscal rules will be an easy task. Of course, we know we have different visions and interests around the table, but my view is that we have something new, which is the common awareness of at least a couple of problems. First, the enormous need of investments, of course, mainly private investments, but also public investments. If we are serious in our messages on the climate transition, the digital competitiveness of Europe, etc. And second, the awareness of the fact that the level of the debt is so high after the pandemic. We have in the euro area 100% of debt on average, which is compatible with the market conditions now because of the very low interest environment. But of course, it is something that we have to reduce. But the awareness is there that this reduction should be gradual and growth friendly. How can you reduce the debt in a growth friendly way? Is this an oxymoron, or can we find a way? And this is I think, my task and the task of the
It's a challenging task. Also given the fact that this is designed to have a medium and long-term effect on restructuring the European economy. But in the meanwhile, you two said this week that the headwinds on the recovery of the economy are increasing. You name it, we live in the shortage economy, shortage of components, shortage of raw materials, and bottlenecks in the logistic, inflation, energy prices that are rising. What's the main concern you do have? And do you think this will, in a way or another, change the path that you were designing for the economic in Europe?
Talking about headwinds, I still think that the main one is still the pandemic. Of course, this creates uncertainty in our societies and also in our economies.
Should vaccination be mandatory in Europe?
Well, these are choices that are under discussion in member states. This is not something that we decide in Brussels. It is connected also to different jurisdictions. Is this possible in your country or not? But of course, we encourage strongly the vaccination and all tools that are reinforcing vaccination. But yes, uncertainty connected to the pandemic for sure. But the experience shows us that despite these uncertainties, despite the risk of the new variants, apparently the economy adapted to the pandemic in the recent months. So my view is that, yes, we can have headwinds created by the pandemic. This could affect some sectors more involved with contact with persons. But overall, we see in several countries, including in Italy, for example, manufacture in Italy is going at full speed, despite the uncertainty for the pandemic, the bottlenecks, the raw materials, the semiconductors. All this is a downside risk to this recovery, but the recovery is there and very strongly there. We have never seen my generation such rate of growth.
It's a good story that needs to be told, I think, more broadly. And Commissioner, I wanted to also ask you, Winston Churchill once famously said in 1945 in Yalta that we should never let a good crisis go to waste. And that quote has been dusted off a lot this week in the context of these recovery funds. I'm wondering what you see as the pitfalls or potential problems. What are your concerns about how the expenditure of these funds could go wrong?
This is indeed a great challenge, because the success of this unprecedented operation is connected to the results that we will achieve. I don't think that now is the time to discuss, will this operation be repeated maybe on other subjects? Okay, this is a legitimate discussion, but the problem now is to make it work. And if we are able to make it work, we will be able to have a discussion on the future of this methodology, not of this next generation EU, which is clearly an extraordinary tool, but the methodology could be used again if it works. And the challenge is quite important, especially for countries like my country that have larger amounts in absolute term, not in relative term. In relative term, Italy is not having the top contribution. Other countries are having the top contribution. But of course, in absolute term, Italy is having quite important amount of money and is one among the countries with traditional difficulty in absorption of European funds. And so I appreciate the commitment of the government to try not only to follow this operation, but to reform our own mechanism of the public administration to make them more apt to the task, because the task is quite an important one. If you have 200 billion euros to invest in a pre-decided way, because this is something is decided now in 2021, how you will spend this money in the next 5 or 6 years. You can't lose this opportunity, but to avoid to lose this opportunity, you have to change also something in the way we work as government institutions. And this is why it's so important that the Italian government is moving in this direction.
Well, Commissioner, the main headline here at Met this year was leverage transition. we are in an energy transition, and the best part of the discussion here has been on energy as a common good for a positive agenda to create more cooperation. But we're living an energy crisis. In the EU in November, energy prices were up 27%, inflation is running at 4.9%. So what can government do to mitigate the impact of these energy prices on families, firms, individual, before it sparkle a reaction to what some says it's connected with the energy transition?
Well, first of all, I would say that I agree with a quite recent statement of the OECD suggesting not to put on the same basket the different level of inflations that we have in the world. Particularly, the OECD was referring to the difference of the US situation from the EU situation from the Japan situation. Of course, EU is in the middle as level of inflation. US is now with a quite high level of inflation, and Japan is still with a quite low level of inflation. So the reaction answers are not the same all over the world. As far as Europe is concerned, of course, the discussion is how long this peak of inflation will last. Our view is that we are having this rise of inflation in this period, maybe for a few months in the near future, but the factors increasing inflation should fade next year, especially after beginning in the spring. This is the common assessment of the Commission and of the ECB. So don't ignore, monitor, look closely, but avoid to react in a wrong way to what happens. For energy, of course, we have a problem of high supply, of low supply, and the reopening of the economies is creating a huge demand. We have energy, gas coming from Norway and from Algeria, quite at full capacity. We have gas coming from Russia at minus 25% in October and November in relation to October and November of last year. And of course, if we look to the demand of energy, October, November of last year and October or November of this year, the fact that we have minus 25% is a big problem. How long will this last? How can we mitigate this? Well, we gave some messages. I think the Commission is encouraging governments to react, especially to mitigate this impact for vulnerable households. This, I think, is a good message. But you don't solve the problem of gas supply in a couple of weeks, of course. At the same time, if you look to the market of the futures for energy, we see that the perspective for next year are not of a quite sure increase. Because at the end, this peak will, this is my view, but it is not only my view, it's the view, I would say, of the large majority of institutions and academia in Europe, will peak, is peaking, and then will decrease also for energy prices. We don't have easy solution. We should continue to invest in renewables, because taking this problem on the wrong way, slowing down the transition, would be the wrong decision.
Amy?
Commissioner, how much do you think the shortage from Russia has to do with the geopolitical tensions, and how do you see those resolving themselves, especially in light of what came out of the United States overnight about intelligence predicting or suspecting military action in Ukraine in early 2022?
Well, of course, we should be very vigilant in these scenarios you are mentioning. Of course, the European Union is strongly supporting Ukraine and also strongly supporting our member states that were facing in the last couple of months a quite an unprecedented crisis with Belarus on migration. Is the supply of gas conditioned by geopolitics? Yes, always. I don't think, having said this, that it's always influenced by geopolitics, I don't think that now it is in the interests of Russia to have an extreme fight with the European Union in gas supply, because around this discussion, you know, there are several things. Among these things, the Nord Stream 2 story, which is, I think, something interesting for the Russian leadership. And so I think that geopolitics is always there when we are talking of energy supply, but the crisis should not be pushed above a certain level. So my concern is more on the what is the evolution in Ukraine, what is the evolution in this border crisis, apparently less acute than a few weeks ago with Belarus. I think that gas supply will not be used in a worse way than it has already been used. But the problem is there. If you see minus 25%, it's something.
Now, Commissioner, overnight happened also another thing which is more Italian related, because the rating agency Fitch upgraded Italy to a BBB. The last upgrade happened in 2017 from S&P, and you were prime minister at the time, if I'm not wrong. So how do you see the situation of the Italian economy, given that you just discussed also individual budget plans for 2022 at the European level, but also talking about the different countries? And in the case of Italy, you discussed also the current expenditure, warning the country to rein in the level of current expenditure.
Well, indeed, what the decision of Fitch is confirming the fact that Italy is going in the right direction. And the level of growth that we are seeing, as you know, Italy is among the 2 or 3 European countries growing more. This year, I think only France, among the big economies, is growing more than Italy. And next year, Italy is expected to grow more than France. And to keep this level of growth, according to our estimates, also in 2023, with 2.5% growth, which is something that we don't remember since many years. So will we be able to go out from this situation that was defined the low for long situation? Low inflation, low growth, low interest rates, and to have a more dynamic. This is the main road for debt reduction, of course, because if you have such a high level of debt, growth is the main tool to reduce it. But at the same time, the message of the Commission is to keep an eye on the current expenditure because yes, growth is essential, but not necessarily all current expenditure is growth oriented. And this, I think, is something that the government is very much aware of, but it is not only easy in the political dynamic to stress this point.
One point, Commissioner, is that growth is slowing down in Q4, would be the weakest of the year due to all the factors we discussed. Inflation is running high, and those who thought that it was transitory, including the Federal Reserve in the US, had to change their mind. And Jay Powell this week said, sorry, we were wrong. We canceled the word transitory. As Madame Lagarde said this week, it's a hump and it will get back. What do you make of that?
No, I agree. I fully agree with the view of the ECB, and their message is that the main factors that are now creating the rise in inflation will fade next year. This, I think, is a quite understandable statement. Of course, this is one very big picture. Then we know that
inflation is not a fear for you.
Well, it's something you have to monitor. But in itself, what we see is something that in the midterm could even be a progress in comparison to the situation we had before. Of course, if the rise will continue and stay, this will could become a problem. That this is not what we are now estimating, the Commission and the ECB. For example, bottlenecks in supply chains, something will last. Semiconductors, for example, will not be solved tomorrow. The shortage, other bottlenecks are slowly being solved. For example, transports and shipments is not at all so acute as it was a few months ago, and probably in the next months will be less acute than now. So we should also be, I think, very quietly seeing the fact that such a sudden increase in demand and growth in advanced economies never happened. And the fact that this creates difficulties in supply chains, in some raw materials, and inflation pressure is quite obvious. After this recession, you have this growth so fast and so strong, but we should not transform this, which is a quite good thing, in a matter of, in a nightmare. It's not a nightmare. It's the fact that the economy is rebounding. Then, of course, we should monitor very closely if there are factors that brings this level of inflation to be permanent, which would be, of course, a problem.
Amy.
We have big flashing zeros.
So
I'm brokenhearted, Commissioner. I don't think I can ask you another question.
okay.
I wanted to ask about foreign aid to the greater MENA region as one last thing in connection with the recovery fund, but I think we might have to save that for another time, or if you have a
quick response.
5-second response to that.
No, I think we worked a lot. First of all, on vaccines. We don't remember always the fact that Europe is, by large, the larger exporter of vaccines in the world. 1.4 billion of doses exported since we have a monitor of export. So since last February, 1.4. This is much more than doses distributed in the Union, which are 1.1 billion. And significant, but in my view, still insufficient level of donation. The Europe donated 120 million doses, 60% through COVAX, 40% through direct donations. And a substantial part of this is going to North Africa and Western Balkans, 22 million for North Africa, what we call the southern neighborhood in the European Union, and 5 million doses in the Western Balkans. So we have no time to speak about foreign aid in general, but I think that commitment on vaccination was a concrete demonstration of how, for the European Union, this Mediterranean environment is friend and important.
Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We have to leave it there. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Andrea.